Before there were nations, before there were cities, before there were kings or gods carved in stone, there was only the wind. And somewhere beneath an ancient sky, a small group of human beings looked up at the stars and wondered. They had no armies, no palaces, no written language. They had nothing but fire in their hands and a hunger in their hearts that would one day reshape the entire world. Everything you have ever known, every city that has ever burned, every empire that has ever fallen, every idea that has ever changed the course of history, began with them. And what they built across 100,000 years of struggle, genius, war, and wonder is the most extraordinary story ever told. It begins not with a king, not with a conquest, but with silence. Around 300,000 years ago, in the vast grasslands and forests of Africa, the earliest anatomically modern humans walked the earth. They were hunters and gatherers, moving in small bands, following the rhythms of seasons and animals. They faced predators, drought, disease, and the crushing uncertainty of daily survival. Yet even in those earliest chapters of our story, something remarkable was happening. These ancient people were thinking. They were communicating. They were burying their dead with care. They were mixing pigments and pressing their hands against cave walls in what can only be described as an act of artistic expression. A declaration that they existed, that they felt, that they mattered. By around 70,000 years ago, a small population of these humans began moving out of Africa, spreading first into the Arabian Peninsula, then into Asia, Europe, and eventually across the entire planet. This was not a planned migration. It was a slow, generational drift across tens of thousands of years. But it placed human beings on nearly every continent, adapting brilliantly to environments as different as the frozen Arctic and the dense tropical rainforest. The human species was already proving one of its most defining qualities, an almost supernatural ability to adapt. Then came the change that altered everything. Around 12,000 years ago, in a crescent-shaped region of fertile land stretching from modern-day Iraq through Syria and into the eastern Mediterranean, human beings did something they had never done before. They stopped moving. They planted seeds, watched them grow, and returned to harvest them. Agriculture, the most consequential invention in human history, was born. And with it, the entire structure of human life began to transform. If you find this story as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing and joining us on this journey through the full sweep of human history. Settlements grew where fields flourished. Surplus food meant that not everyone needed to farm, freeing some individuals to specialize, wanting to become potters, weavers, priests, and administrators. Communities that once numbered in the dozens swelled to hundreds, then thousands. And somewhere along the way, the village became a town, and the town became something far more complex and far more dangerous: the city. Nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. By around 3,500 BCE, the Sumerians had built some of the world's first true cities. Uruk, one of the greatest of these, may have housed tens of thousands of people at its peak. Its towering ziggurat rose above the flat floodplains like a human-made mountain, a statement of ambition and devotion visible for miles in every direction. But perhaps the Sumerians' most enduring contribution was not in stone. It was in clay. They developed cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems in history, pressing symbols into wet clay tablets to record transactions, laws, and eventually stories. The written word had arrived, and with it, humanity gained the ability to preserve knowledge across generations. To the west, along the banks of the Nile, another civilization was awakening with equal brilliance and even greater longevity. Ancient Egypt, unified around 3,100 BCE under its first pharaohs, would endure for over 3,000 years, a span of time so vast it remains almost incomprehensible. The Egyptians built monuments that still stand today, engineered irrigation systems that turned desert into farmland, developed their own sophisticated writing in the form of hieroglyphics. and constructed an elaborate theology that gave their society extraordinary cohesion and purpose. The Great Pyramid of Giza, completed around 2560 BCE, required the coordinated labor of tens of thousands of workers and remains one of the greatest feats of engineering in all of history. It was not built by slaves, as was once assumed, but largely by organized, paid Egyptian laborers, a detail that quietly reframes our understanding of ancient Egyptian society. While Egypt flourished in the northeast of Africa, another remarkable civilization was quietly thriving thousands of miles away. Along the Indus River in the Indian subcontinent, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were built with a sophistication that still astonishes archaeologists. Streets were laid out in near-perfect grids. Buildings had standardized brick sizes. An advanced drainage and sanitation system ran beneath the city. Infrastructure that would not be seen again in many parts of the world for thousands of years. The Indus Valley Civilization, at its height around 2500 BCE, may have been home to over 5 million people. And yet it remains one of history's most tantalizing mysteries, because their writing has never been fully deciphered, and the story of their decline remains uncertain. Still farther east along the Yellow River basin of China, early Chinese civilization was taking shape with its own distinctive genius. By around 2000 BCE, complex societies were developing in this region, and by the time of the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, the Chinese had developed bronze casting, early forms of writing, and elaborate ritual practices centered on ancestor veneration. China's civilization would evolve continuously for millennia, developing technologies and philosophical traditions that would eventually influence the entire world. What strikes us again and again as we survey these early civilizations is that they were not isolated accidents. They were responses to the same fundamental human drives: the need to organize, to create meaning, to preserve knowledge, and to build something that outlasted individual lives. And increasingly, these civilizations were not truly isolated from one another. Trade routes, even in the ancient world, carried not only goods but ideas. Pause here and let us know in the comments which ancient civilization fascinates you the most. The answers might surprise you. By the first millennium BCE, the ancient world was entering one of its most intellectually explosive periods. In Greece, a collection of city-states perched on rocky peninsulas and scattered islands gave rise to something without clear precedent: democracy, philosophy, theater, and a tradition of rational inquiry that asked not merely what the gods decreed, but what human reason could discover. Athens, during its classical golden age in the 5th century BCE, produced minds like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, whose questions about justice, reality, ethics, and governance would echo through every subsequent century of Western thought. Meanwhile, in the military city-state of Sparta, an entirely different model of human society was being tested, one built on discipline, collective sacrifice, and martial excellence. The tension between these two visions of civilization would produce some of ancient Greece's most defining conflicts, but it was ultimately the external pressure of Persia's vast empire that forced the Greek city-states into an unlikely unity, producing legendary stands like the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, where a small force held back an overwhelming army long enough to change the course of the war and arguably the course of Western civilization. And then came Alexander. Born in Macedonia in 356 BCE, Alexander the Great would lead one of the most breathtaking military campaigns in human history, sweeping through Persia, Egypt, Central Asia, and into the Indian subcontinent within just over a decade. But Alexander's true legacy was not conquest. It was cultural fusion. In his wake, Greek language, art, and philosophy blended with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions in a period historians call the Hellenistic Age. Ideas were no longer contained within borders. The world, for the first time, was becoming interconnected in ways that could never be fully undone. Into this interconnected world stepped Rome. What began as a small settlement on the hills above the Tiber River in central Italy grew, through centuries of warfare, diplomacy, and institutional innovation, into one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. The Roman Republic, established around 509 BCE, developed systems of law, governance, and civic organization that became foundational to entire traditions of political thought. Roman engineering transformed the landscape of Europe and the Mediterranean. Roads that stretched for tens of thousands of miles, aqueducts that carried water across mountainous terrain, and cities from Britain to North Africa built to a common architectural language. At the empire's height under emperors like Augustus and Trajan, Rome governed a population of perhaps 70 million people across an enormous territory. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, provided centuries of relative stability that allowed trade, culture, and population to flourish. But no empire lasts forever, and Rome carried within it the seeds of its own unraveling.